I just performed a major overhaul on this Atomic 4 1975 era engine. It was in my sailboat. I had a broken valve spring, and the only way to diagnose these engines for the most part is to take them out and take them apart. I could have done it in the boat, but as it turned out, I wanted to make a complete overhaul, which I did. It occurs to me that since I've got it all out, exposed, painted up pretty, I would do a walk around so that you get a chance to know some of the things that I knew or didn't understand completely when I did the overhaul, and I'll point all the components out to you in case you've never really looked at your engine. This will give you a good overview. We'll start here. At my left is the forward side of the engine, which normally you think of the flywheel as being at the rear part of the engine, but the way the Atomic 4 is made, the rear part of the engine is where the prop shaft coupling is. So the front part of the engine is here to the left. So we're looking now at the top and port side of the engine. We'll get in closer and take a look at some of the components and their locations. So on the port side of the engine here, starting off near the bottom, you'll see where we've got a oil pressure transducer coming out of a port on the side of the engine. Then the carburetor is down at the bottom. To the right of the carburetor is the mechanical fuel pump. This piece that is coming out here is a brace that is bolted on the rear of the engine. It's where the standoffs are attached to run your throttle cable and choke cable. Up above is the exhaust manifold at the top and the intake manifold at the bottom of it, and then the carburetor is mounted on the underside of that. Here's a little closer view of the lower area, showing clearly where the carburetor is located, and the oil pressure sender that goes back and is tied into a port here on the block. The mechanical fuel pump and fuel bowl, and around the back, I'll get a different angle, you'll see where the oil pressure adjustment is. Oil pressure adjustment is right here, kind of underneath this stainless steel fuel bowl for the fuel pump. And there's a big lock nut on it, and you turn the screw in and out to adjust the oil pressure. A quartering view here at the rear of the engine shows you the 4 bolts that attach this plate. That's how you get in to be able to adjust the transmission, the forward and reverse adjustments on the transmission. The shift lever ties to your shift linkage in the cockpit. Look up above, you'll see where the coil is mounted here on the back of the block. There is where your exhaust manifold pipe for your hose going out to the through hull through the stern for your exhaust is. The oil dipstick is actually mounted in the top of the reverse gear case and measures the oil in that area. The oil is a common supply for that area and the internal parts of the engine. There's the propeller shaft. Those three holes are where the propeller shaft flange bolts up at the back of the engine. And you'll notice that there's 1, 2, 3 of these bolts down here that have brass washers underneath there because they're below the center line. Here's the parting surface for the oil pan. The oil pan is a big casting. Your actual mounts for mounting the engine to the rails or mounts in the engine compartment is actually attaching to the bottom part of the oil pan. It's a big casting and becomes a structural part of the engine itself. Now we're looking at the rear of the engine on the starboard side. This is where your water pump is. Your distributor drops in here in this accessory drive case, which is bolted up with through bolts when you're reinstalling the forward reverse case. The forward reverse case is a separate component that includes this flange here, all the way around these bolts here and so on. So when you have assembled the engine, you have the oil pan already mounted and this area is all exposed. Once you install everything there, then you put that gear case on and connect up the linkage. Toughest part of overhauling this engine was figuring out how to get that linkage hooked up. It's a little difficult, but it can be done. You'll notice that over here and back over here, that's where the engine mounts to the rails. I've made this cradle for picking up the whole engine. This is all attached. This cradle is attached to this mover's dolly. Costs about 20 bucks at Harbor Freight. And what I'm going to be able to do then is pick the whole thing up, sit it in the back of my pickup, pick it up with the SkyTrack with a chain out of my pickup, and carry it to the dock, and then pull it down the dock on this dolly till I get to where the boom has the chain fall attached, and then I'll pick it up. So looking here at the right side of the engine, what we're looking at is, this is the water, what they call the water plate. You'll notice that that also has bolts with washers, because that needs to be all sealed up real good. Here's a bracket on the top of the engine. That's where the alternator mounts. This is the adjusting arm for the alternator. There's where the alternator is driven off of this accessory drive, and the alternator pulley would be right here. Upper part here is the old thermostat housing. This has a freshwater cooled Indigo thermostat system, and I'll walk you through what all is hooked up on that. Right here in this area here is where the starter mounts. I'm leaving the starter and the alternator all painted up pretty and shrink wrapped in plastic to be installed once I have the engine in the boat, because that probably adds 50 pounds of the 350 pounds of the weight is between the alternator and the starter. Here's a quartering view looking at the flywheel housing from the starboard front area. So this is the flywheel housing here, and this plate comes off to expose the flywheel, which is right inside there. There's a much better view of the water plate. The very front of the engine is the flywheel housing. This plate is removed, and that's where the flywheel is. And you can see the oil filler cap right there. And then we'll take a look at the cooling system with the Indigo thermostat system. So the cooling system hoses are routed like this. Right here is the inlet to the water pump. That's what's going to attach off to our line to our strainer and so on. So the water comes into the water pump here and comes out in two places. One place goes around and goes to the underside right here of the thermostat housing. That water can't flow until the thermostat opens. So the other part, which goes to this water plate here, goes into the engine, also continues on up here, and part of that water bypasses through here and out through the exhaust. The old thermostat is the outlet of the water coming out of the engine, and it goes into a nipple up here on that same log along the port side, and then mixes with exhaust gases and goes out through that hose. Overhauling this engine was actually kind of a fun experience and not particularly hard. You need a good set of tools, and you'll need a few specialty tools. The main thing is you want one of these Moyer Marine Atomic 4 service and overhaul manuals, because it'll walk you through and save you an awful lot of grief. Could you overhaul this engine if you didn't have this manual? You probably could, but it is really, really helpful, and it has pretty much all the information that you're going to need. Okay, let's talk about what it takes to disassemble this engine for overhaul. Again, if you have that Moyer Marine manual, that's pretty much all you need. It'll walk you through disassembling and so on. I'll point out everything that has to be removed. The order in most cases doesn't matter that much. I would follow the order that Moyer Marine has shown. As I said, I found that removing the starter and the alternator before I pulled it out of the boat made it a little easier. So these are not reinstalled yet, because I'm going to put it back in the boat in the next couple of days. But let's take a look at what has to be removed here. Here along the starboard side, you have these 8 bolts that attach that side plate. You remove those. You remove the hose that attaches, then goes back to the water pump, and the hose that goes up to the bypass area of the Indigo thermostat system. 1 bolt. After you have labeled, the engine is numbered starting with the number 1 cylinder the most forward, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4. The firing order is 1, 2, 4, 3. So what you want to do is, before you take anything off, label the plug wires. I've got, was showing the top, you'll see that I've got the plug wire caps numbered 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the number 1 is facing outboard away from the block. Once you've labeled those, and the number 1 position has a sticker on the side of the distributor that you can know is the number 1 position, you can remove the wires, remove the distributor cap, take this 1 bolt out of here, take this clip off, and then the distributor pulls out. Okay? Once you've done that, you've got 2 bolts along the side here that attach the water pump. You can remove the water pump. You can remove this block drain here. Remove the, assuming that you're going to paint all the components, remove the alternator arm, so on. And that pretty much does it along this side. Again, you've got the starter removed, the alternator removed, the water jacket side plate, the distributor, and the water pump. On the port side of the engine, disassembly involves taking these 2 bolts off, and that will allow the carburetor and the air box here complete to be dropped down. You have 2 bolts, which are not easy to see, but 2 bolts that attach the fuel pump, and you can pull off your oil pressure sender as well. Disconnect this hose that attaches here, this that gets fumes out of the air box, and then 3 nuts, and then this whole intake exhaust manifold and this whole log once you disconnect the hoses that have to be disconnected, which doesn't include disconnecting this, then the thermostat stays right on that log. Your engine may look a little different depending on whether or not you have the Indigo external thermostat or whether you have raw water cooling instead of just fresh water cooling. Removing the cylinder head involves removing all 17 of those nuts, and then using a hammer and a couple of screwdrivers, tapping and getting around where the gasket is in the joint between the head and the block. And it will take a fair amount of work, but once you get it coming, then you'll lift the whole cylinder head off, and then you'll have the valves and the cylinder bores exposed. You can just barely see this plate in here. This plate runs from here and attaches with two bolts. One is in there, one is over on the other side, and the plate comes all the way the length of the block. When you remove that plate, that's how you can access the valve tappets and the valve springs and so on. You can pull the cylinder head off, and if you're just going to do a cylinder head gasket and not fool with the valves and whatever, you don't have to take that plate off, because all you got to do is take off enough stuff to get to the cylinder head. In my case, I was going to disassemble the whole engine and inspect, so I needed to go far. So once you have removed the plate and removed the cylinder head, you'll need to pull this bracket off and all of the bolts. There are 4 bolts there, 4 bolts on the other side, and bolts that come around here. You'll pull off the 4 bolts for that plate, expose your linkage, disconnect the linkage, and then pull that whole case off. You have to do that to be able to remove the camshaft and so on. Before you can pull that case off, you'll need to pull this rear flange off. So you've got a nut here. You'll have to hold the engine because it's going to want to turn, but you're going to back that nut off. Then you're going to run some bolts in that are longer than the bolts that attach the prop shaft flange, and using those bolts against the back of this flange, it will pull that out of there. There's a keyway in there. There's no way to get it out without using those bolts to push it off. Once you have that off, you can take off these bolts, pull that off, pull this other part off, and now your tail shaft is exposed. And then when you remove all of the bolts for that housing, the housing is able to lift up and everything is exposed. You'll have to pull the reverse gear and that band and all the other stuff out of there, and what you're left with is just the end of the crankshaft with the oil pump and this accessory drive gear and so on and so forth. Once you have the head off and all the parts that you want to, you can turn the engine over on the top of the block, and then you can remove all the bolts holding the oil pan. The oil pan casting is heavy. It probably weighs 50, 60 pounds or something like that. So once you get it all off, you can set it aside, and now you're able to see the crankshaft. You'll remove the camshaft. You'll remove all the valve springs, remove the valves, and once you turn it over on the bare top of the block, then you can get to the crankshaft. You remove the crankshaft. It's all fairly straightforward. And then what I would suggest is take the block and the crankshaft along with your specs to a local machine shop. You can do these measurements yourself, but it's an awful lot easier. Tell them what the wear limits are for the crankshaft and anything else you think will be helpful to them. They can go ahead and clean the block. If they're going to caustic clean the block, you're going to have to replace the camshaft bearings. If you just have pressure wash the block, they'll go ahead and clean it up some more without messing with the camshaft bearings. And then you'll find out where you stand on your main bearings and rod bearings and so on. In my case, the main bearings and rod bearings were standard. I replaced the bearings, but they just had to polish the crankshaft. I did not have to have the crankshaft turned. So I replaced all the valve springs, the main bearings, the rod bearings, the piston rings, and now that I've got it all back together, I'm looking forward to having a brand new engine in my boat. I hope this has been helpful to you. If you have any questions or comments, go ahead and send me an email off of the link that's on the YouTube page. Thanks for watching.